April Blood is a new book from Lauro Martinez, exploring the political feuds in Florence during the Italian Renaissance. This History on Book TV feature is an hour.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, good evening. It's a pleasure and an honor, really, to be here. Shall I turn this on? I'm actually strapped for things. Is that better now? Perhaps I should begin with a few words about the contents of April Blood. On a Sunday in late April 1478, at High Mass in the Cathedral of Florence, a circle of conspirators set out to assassinate the two heads of the Medici family, Lorenzo the Magnificent and his younger brother, Giuliano. The plot is known as the Pazzi Conspiracy. Still a free republic, at least in name, Florence, for more than 40 years, had been under the devious rule of the Medici family and their close supporters. Now, on that late April, the Pazzi, another family of great Florentine bankers and the premier rivals of the Medici, were about to vent their rage on a close relative by marriage, none other than the magnificent Lorenzo, who had toiled for years. Lorenzo had toiled for years, although working behind their backs, to keep the whole Pazzi clan out of office, out of public office. And in Florence, if you were rich and distinguished, and yet were secretly denied the top political offices, then you lived without the public honors which were yours by right of birth, and you were thereby stripped of some part of your humanity. Well, the plot miscarried. The conspirators killed the glamorous Giuliano, but Lorenzo got away with a slight wound. For a few hours, the survival of the regime itself lay in the balance. Then the tide suddenly turned against the Pazzi and their accomplices, and that afternoon the backlash of reprisals began. A bloodbath followed. Men were thrown out of the windows of the great government palace, or they were cut down at will. And that evening, according to Machiavelli and the humanist Poliziano, the government square seems to have been littered with body parts. But the event was far more than a local Florentine affair. For behind the Pazzi, looming up and lending them the support of troops and money, were Pope Sixtus IV, Ferrante, the King of Naples, and that great patron of the arts, the Duke of Urbino. Papal troops had approached the walls of Florence, where a city gate had been secured by the conspirators, and but for the play of luck and incompetence, they would have seized the Palazzo della Signoria, the government bastion. Among the conspirators were at least a half-dozen priests, the Archbishop of Pisa and the young Cardinal of San Giorgio, one of the Pope's nephews. Only the Cardinal, who was to be used as a bargaining stake, would escape with his life. All Italy was astonished, and now Pope, King, and Duke had to step forth from behind the scenes to throw their weight against Lorenzo and his friends in Florence. They proposed nothing less than to reshape Florentine foreign affairs. War broke out, the so-called Pazzi War, and now to Milan and Venice, as Florentine allies, stepped in to help defend Florence and the Medicean regime. There is no point in my telling you more here when the book itself, I hope, does a better job of laying out the tale. 2 points, however, call for a note of emphasis. First of all, the Pazzi conspiracy plunged the Italian peninsula into a major bout of tensions and violence, while also highlighting the fragility of local alliances and the fault lines of ambition, envy, and fear. Secondly, and this is most important, Florence under the early Medici and right up to the 16th century always nursed deep and fierce resentments against the domination of the Medici and of their colluding circle of influential Florentine supporters. For they and their regime were relentlessly tightening their chokehold on the city's offices and political councils, suppressing open debate, destroying recalcitrant families, exiling opponents. In short, eroding the Republican institutions that went back in the history of Florence for more than 200 years. And Lorenzo the Magnificent, love poet, connoisseur, author of smutty carnival songs, sometime Neoplatonist and patron of the arts, stood at the pivotal point in the transition from free republic to tyranny, a new Renaissance principle. The all but fatal injuries inflicted on Florentine political sensibilities were revealed in the mid-1490s when, with the overthrow of the Medici, the city's traditional ruling class suddenly seemed set to tear itself apart. 60 years of Medici rule had turned the old ideal of serving the commune, that is, of serving the common good, into the mere question of whether or not to fight for the return of the Medici or to serve one of the several aristocratic factions for sectarian purposes. The vision of a wider and more impartial constituency had faded. And this explains the Friar Savonarola's extraordinary authority during those years, because with his passionate plea for the Republic and for a larger political good, he was filling a moral vacuum at the heart of public life in Florence. Now, in view of its extraordinary lineaments, the question arises, why have no serious historian ever cast a book around the April plot? The answer, I think, has to do with our fear of seeming to stoop down to what smacks of repulsive violence and journalistic vulgarity. Furthermore, the plot has always struck experts as so awful, bloody, and obviously complete that it seemed to speak for itself. No historical research was necessary. It was a simple tale of one powerful family going for the throat of another. And the other Italian states came into the picture as mere lesser participants in a dull game of diplomatic chess. But again, the ugly spectacle of hurled and quartered human bodies was not for us, the serious historians. Even last week, the academic reviewer of April Blood in the Times Literary Supplement came up to me in London and made a quick, disparaging remark about all those bodies. I'm going to tell you the story this evening of how and why I wrote April Blood. When the book climbed into London's bestseller listings at the end of February, about 15 days after publication, my publishers, Jonathan Cape of the Random House Group, were pleasantly surprised, and so was I. Why not? The book had been reviewed in the Sunday papers and in some of the dailies, with notices that helped to launch it. Of all places, London's Time Out gave it a notice, and it was picked as the book of the week by a publication called The Week. There were then 2 rapid reprintings, and meanwhile, the book had been selected by the History Guild in the UK, and here in America by the History Book Club, who made it their choice by consulting the English original. Something very odd was happening. I had published 8 previous books, but not one, not even remotely, had ever attracted such notice. My playing field was another, where the vast majority of titles, academic books, sell in the range of, say, 400 to 1,800 copies, and this only after 2 or 3 years, unless the book is regularly chosen for classroom use. Having paid out a generous advance for April Blood, Jonathan Cape, I supposed, expected good continuing sales, but nothing like what they got. So, what to conclude about buyers and readers of the book? That violence and political terrorism mixed with a dash of religious fervor are in? That these are the stuff of a recent and powerful appeal in the face of current anxieties? Sure. I have no doubt that part of the book's commercial success has this element behind it. And most reviewers, interestingly, closed in on that link, gave it some prominence, and sought to draw out a lesson or two. But I also know that I could have written April Blood with a different title and in such a way as to attract no high street attention, no press comments, by directing the book at the tiny group of experts who work on the history of Florence. A mischievous spirit took over. I decided that I had done enough of that, written chiefly for the experts. And this is what I'd like to talk about, because it brings up the subject of academic history in its ties with narrative and styles of prose. I left the university 10 years ago, and once I got away, permanently away from colleagues and students and the whole mode of thinking, I began to see something about the ways in which history at the university is hobbled by being aimed at a specialized elite. The story of how this happens and how it rules our days is easily told. It begins in graduate school, as we all know, and our preparation for the doctoral dissertation. At that critical time for several years, we live and run closely with others like ourselves, looking up to the same ideals and perfecting a language of specialists as we get ready to jump the big hurdle, that specimen of erudition, the doctoral dissertation. The summit of our ambition is to win praise and glory among the top scholars in the field, for the way to our first academic appointment will be there. And there, too, is the source of the highest respect that we can ever hope to have as intellectuals. Democrats in our hearts, yet in our work, we look exclusively to a select group in a stance that goes with a whole style and language. Then, if there is a first book, it is almost certainly a revised version of the dissertation, and if a second book, then it must be cut more or less in the same fashion, particularly when we are to come up against the anxieties of tenure, further promotion, and research grants. But there is more. Above all, the web of intellectual relations in the academic world, more specifically in one's history department, in hiring and promotion committees, in conversations with colleagues and students, and not least, it seems to me, in a vital correspondence with other specialists in the field who are at distant universities or who may even reside in Europe. All this, as we pursue our research and writing, leads us to produce a certain kind of history. Actually, I dare say, the most serious and reputable kind. For if there is such a thing as scientific or objective history, historical writing that is rigorous about evidence and analysis, then it can only come from the best of academic history, the foundations for which are laid down in graduate school. And I would not change any of this, because if history is to be other than propaganda for jingo patriots and low-grade politicians, then it has to strive for evidential rigor and detached analysis. I cannot emphasize this enough. And yet, as we go on writing our academic history, something happens along the way, something almost destructive. We come to believe that there is only one audience out there for us, a single set of readers, the professors, especially the ones in our field. Or if we produce a textbook, then we bring in that larger circle of college and university students. But every serious textbook has its special pleadings, along with a particular tone or flavor. It must smack of the classroom. And this, of course, can only be done by means of language and style. Simon Schama, I would venture, Linda Colley, and the late Roy Porter, and others like these, must have seen this in the course of their careers. That is, that the most accomplished professional historians go out of their way to restrict their reading audiences, thereby abandoning their subject matter to the popularizers and to so-called professional writers. with the result that most people tend to get their history in this mold, if indeed they get any at all. Now, to indicate an alternative route for the professional historian, I'm going to put all my cards on the table this evening and reveal my winding way to the writing of April Blood. I wrote a novel a few years ago and was lucky enough at a dinner party in London to meet a literary agent from New York. We became friends. She read and liked the novel and agreed to help me find a publisher. In the first round of activity, we failed. We failed. The book, it seems, was too highbrow, in spite of the fact that I had struggled to write something popular, if not quite a bodice ripper. Over a period of a year or two, I revised it twice, a good idea, because I had produced the first draft in 11 weeks in something like an ecstatic surge of energy. Meanwhile, however, time was passing. My friend and agent was eager to have another book, and she had excellent contacts in publishing circles, one of whom, it turned out, was a leading editor in London, a man who liked my 1979 book, Power and Imagination. One day, she came to me with a message from him. He would like very much to have a new book from me, a history. All I had to do was to pick a subject, anything in the Renaissance, and submit a treatment or short sketch, which, as I remember in this case, came to something like 8 or 9 pages. If the idea appealed to the editor, one that he could then press on his colleagues, my agent would negotiate the details and an agreement would be drawn up, with a view to securing, of course, an advance on royalties. Those of us who are retired have to think about such things. Well, this is a standard feature, you should know, of trade book publishing, and has behind it the wise assumption that the more a publisher commits in advance, the more committed he is bound to be thereafter. In this regard, at least, practice in trade book publishing is radically different from anything to be found in the procedures of most university presses. Now, suddenly, I began to think about the Pazzi conspiracy, for the very good reason that in one way or another, that dramatic April of 1478 had been haunting me for more than 25 years. But my immediate private reaction at that moment was one of shame. What, I thought, write the history of an event that smacks of sensationalism? Wasn't this why no professional historian had ever written a book on the famous plot? Could I lend myself to it? So that here was that odi profanos attitude picked up many years ago in the Harvard Graduate School. The amateur Harold Acton had produced the only book ever written on the subject, and it is really a scandal. It is little more than what Lorenzo de' Medici's protege, Polizzano, had narrated in his mendacious commentary on the conspiracy, a complete sort of whitewash of the Medici on the one side and a total blackening on the other side, the Pazzi and their friends. And yet I couldn't, as we say, shake the idea. The more I thought about it, the more it appealed. I had never written a book in that vein. It offered a challenge. I could go on writing the kind of history that I'd been writing for years, and in the same style. Or I could break away and try to put together a compelling story. Well, you can see, I was seduced. As for the horrendous bloodbath that ended the foiled conspiracy, I would simply have to deal with that. And anyway, why should I assume that potential readers of the book might be so squeamish as to be unable to put up with descriptions of the horrid desecration of human bodies? Are we, in the modern world, so very far from doing such things? Besides, after 25 years of occasional rumination, I also had the sense that something terribly important had happened on that memorable April. It seemed to me that the electrifying violence of the conspiracy and its aftermath was the external show of political hatreds and venomous bitterness that cut deep into Florentine society and ran back for more than 40 years. And it also occurred to me, but only research could support this, that the April plot marked a historical turning point. I suspected that Lorenzo de' Medici's survival and triumph verged, so to speak, on finally breaking the back of a republic which had been nourished by open political debate for more than 2 centuries, but which now, after 1478, witnessed the spread of a new tyrannical climate, a new guarding of speech, the oblique spread of fear, and the growing readiness of Florentine aristocrats to throw in the towel, to put themselves under the rule of a new signore, a tyrant. The threat of sensationalism was now beside the point. I had the best reasons for turning my hand to April blood. But there remained the question of how to write the book, how to organize it, how to present it. In other words, for whom would I be writing? For my peers in the profession, as I had always done, or for my intelligent friends in London who knew almost nothing of what I do, but whose interest I might be able to capture with a new account of the conspiracy. This either-or question, I decided, was false. Why not go whole hog? Why not try to do the difficult thing, that is, to write at one and the same time for the 2 constituencies, employing a different kind of prose, a different tone, and a primary sense of narrative. For if I could narrate the explosive movements of that April event and not lose their pace, then I was sure that any large circle of readers would have the patience, even the interest, to follow my stretches of analysis and to take in all the background material that would be expected by the professional historians. The first task was to wean myself away from some bad habits and to force myself to use a more common or classic language, especially because the writing of Florentine history is shot through with words and turns of phrase of the sort that professionals constantly use as shorthand. Balie, borse kept a mano, tratte, monte, scrutinio, gonfalone, colleges in a very special sense, gabelles, etc. I also decided that it would be necessary at various points to shy away from excessive detail, such as the particulars of papal policy in central Italy, unless I could lay my hands on a strong enough source or text that could be introduced to speak for itself. If inserted in the right fashion, the raw testimony of the document, such as a letter, a diary, or say, a sentence of execution, often appeals to lay readers of history. But I could go on in this fashion, citing examples of the way in which I was planning to write the book, when the following statement may express this more effectively. From the moment I began to write April Blood, I kept telling myself, I am not writing for an audience of specialists, but rather for a much larger, educated readership. Paradoxically, however, if I keep my passages of historical analysis up to the most serious and searching levels, then the specialists will also want to read the book and perhaps even take it seriously. Never mind that I am determined to use a more everyday language, just as my London friends will accept all levels of analysis if the story is well told, so the specialists in the field will accept English prose of the kind often found in lucid newspaper articles. And as for the question of style, yes, it would be gratifying to achieve some elegance, but above all, I told myself, look for clarity. I should emphasize here that at no point did my publishers say anything at all about the kind of book they desired. I assumed, of course, that they wanted a book that would sell. But remember, university presses also want books that sell. And in our day, they want this very much. What I chose to do with the book was entirely my own doing, although I wanted to reach the professors, I confess. I was determined to do so by writing first for a much wider reading audience. This is what made the game, if you like, more interesting for me. But I was not yet done. Matters of language and tone say nothing about narrative, although this was going to be crucial. How was I to handle a story already so dramatic in its own right? I could easily blow it and tell the thing poorly, than which nothing would have been more embarrassing. So, was it best to cleave to the chronological flow of events in the conventional manner of historians, or should I try a different route? Since I couldn't make up my mind about this, I decided to work with a more flexible overall form. And I'll tell you at once what I mean by that. Fearing that my ability to describe things would not be equal to the narrative force of the conspiracy itself, I wrote each chapter in such a way that it could almost stand alone. This required, here and there, patches of repetition, but these could be easily deleted in the finished manuscript. And the advantage was that I would then be able to move the chapters around at will. Here was my flexible overall form, one that would offer me the opportunity to use flashbacks or elements of surprise. I felt I very much needed this resource or fallback in case I failed to produce the required verve for the explosive scenes in the cathedral and in the government palace. In short, yes, I was counting on narrative, but never, even for a moment, playing fast and loose with accuracy or evidence. For if I did anything like that, how would I ever again be able to confront my cohort of experts in the history of Florence? And therefore, I don't mind telling you, for example, that once the manuscript was ready, 2 or 3 chapters were moved around. And now there was some consultation with my editor at the Oxford University Press in New York. And the original first chapter, moreover, was split in 2, the second part becoming chapter 8. In the end, however, in fact, I used very few flashbacks or other narrative ploys. Reference to my friends in London is a kind of refrain, and there's a reason for this. They are absolutely real, and yet they also serve as a metaphor, because it was by thinking about them, by conjuring up their faces, that I came to envisage a large, ideal reading audience. In my experience of the American scene, we tend, in the USA, to live in ghettos. Doctors and dentists see doctors and dentists. Professors hunt with professors. Showbiz people seek their own kind. And businessmen likewise. The result is, for historians, certainly, that the pivotal experience of specialization in graduate school, the cultivation, the long-term cultivation of a technical vocabulary and of a certain attitude, continue and are nourished for the rest of our lives. We speak the ordinary language of most Americans, to be sure, but when it comes to our work, and especially to our writing, we pass over instinctively to a language of mandarins, and we address only the coterie or core of experts in a given field. Even lecturing to students doesn't help much, because we seek, at least I did, to elevate them. I don't know, and perhaps rightly so, by constantly drawing them into our verbal network. Nevertheless, we are not mathematicians or physicists. When they go out into the social world, they have to leave their formulae and arcane musings back in their studies and places of work. But we go out into a world where people think they know about history, and sometimes they do. And in any case, they talk about it a great deal, mainly because of the impact of current events on their daily sensibilities. If nothing else, politicians, journalists, and radio pundits are often happy to talk to all of us about the so-called lessons of history, as if they were the experts. And what do? We, the professional experts? We say, what do we do about history in the forums where we might be heard? Press, television, and radio. We say nothing. Holding our noses, we stand above all media hype. And so we surrender talk about history to those who at best abuse it and who at worst will want to use it for their own sectarian or murderous purposes. I am suggesting that when they have the writing facility to do so, professional historians have a moral and social obligation to take history out to a larger reading public, beyond college students and beyond the university. But how are we to do this, if not through our books, at least in the first instance? We assume that lay readers are not for us, cannot be reached by us, because they required the honeyed pill of low narrative or of something easily accessible, such as a dumbed-down historical novel. Well, but isn't it a self-indulgent convenience to assume that narrative has to be low and honeyed? It can be demonstrated, I would argue, that there is an enormous public of readers out there who are able to take the best kind of history from us, but we have to break away from our comfortable elitism and write a more classic and common prose, while also seeking or even inventing the narrative modes that can best convey our different stories. This means, after the doctoral dissertation, or after the first book or two, that we must try to get away from exclusive conversation with our colleagues and talk as well to our friends in London, our friends in Boston, Chicago, New York, or wherever. For us to write for them too means a lot of work. It almost means retooling. But it is the only way, ultimately, to offer serious historical reading to a public that loves history, that needs it, and that is somehow rubbing up against it all the time. Yes, they may in turn simplify it, I don't know. But our office somehow is to take history to them, not just to the mandarins, as best we can. I realize that certain historical events and moments and some kinds of history will have a wider appeal than others. A conspiracy, a crisis, a triumph, a sudden change, a great discovery. All these, for example, can be more easily and compellingly narrated. But it strikes me that even the technicalities of legal history, to take a quite different example, could be unfolded or simplified by tackling the subject through the presentation of specific cases where the flesh and blood, so to speak, of the parties in conflict may be used to lead out into the more abstract parts of legal argument. It often happens that a history book appears to have some special relevance for the present. This is partly luck, but more, I suspect, a matter of presentation, especially if the historian has written with some kind of true engagement or commitment, such as when the subject touches something vital in his or her experience. It was only after I completed the first draft of April Blood, about 5 or 6 months after the events of 9/11, that I began to sense some distant resonances in the Pazzi conspiracy for the worst anxieties of our day. However, there was no need for me, and certainly no honorable call, to go into the body of the text, to go back into the body of the text, with an eye to making adjustments of the sort that would hint at possible links with the present. Only once, as I remember, in the prologue, is there the passing whisper of a connection between past and present. And then again, in the concluding pages, with reference to the relentless suppression of open political debate under the Republican Medici, and particularly under the regime of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Historians can no more, I think, get away from politics than from the air they breathe. In this connection, politics, if their personal commitments are deep and informed, then those bearings will ghost through their way of posing historical questions and constructing solutions. But they, the professional historians, do not pull past and present together willfully and tendentiously. Instead, this is a meeting that comes about as part of a whole life experience, and so it comes as naturally as our forms of reasoning. Thank you very much.
Just a reminder, Professor Martinez will take questions, but remember to wait for both of the microphones to get to you.
Yes, do please speak up so that I can hear you properly.
Is there a good way to tell if you're in the library in the history section which books meet the standards of the university and which are just popularized?
Would you speak up a little more?
Okay.
Not quite power.
Hold the mic a little closer to you.
Okay. Is there a way to tell when you look at books in the library, the
Yes.
history books, which meet the level of the university faculty and which are just popular things that are not to be trusted?
No, I can't think of, and certainly you can't judge a book by its cover, even though usually the covers have all been removed, haven't they? So, no, I can't think of a shortcut at all. I think possibly the quickest, best way, but you can go wrong there too, is to keep up with the reviews in the reputable places, not just in the professional periodicals where it will often take a review 2 or 3 years to appear from the time a book has been published. But I do think places like the Times Literary Supplement and the New York Review of Books and the serious Sunday papers, I would say, the New York Times, Book Review, and that kind of thing, I think, is extremely important. And when you've done enough of that, you begin to get a sense of what things are, and you can then more easily, more effectively make your choices.
I don't know if this is worth waiting for.
I can't find you.
I don't know if that was worth waiting. Mine is worth waiting for, but I wondered what the reactions of your former academic colleagues or current academic colleagues are to this message of yours to get out into the world.
There were 2 or 3 of, I would say that offhand, about 3 of the reviews in London thus far were written by academics. One man at Cambridge, and a woman in one of the London universities, yes. There was no problem about it. I think they took the book seriously. Yeah, but I frankly have no idea of what is likely to happen in the field here and in Italy, for instance, the 2 major places for a reaction to the book, a serious reaction to the book.
Do you intend to devote any articles to this subject? Do you intend to devote any articles to this subject or talk about it in truly academic fora?
You mean the thing I gave this evening?
Yes.
I think it might be a good idea if I try to do this little talk up in proper form and try to place it somewhere, because I do feel passionately about it. I think that if I went back to UCLA now, and which I would like to do in some way, I would like to get all my colleagues into a corner and talk to them and talk to the graduate students and tell them, yes, do this for the first book or 2, but at some point you have to begin to think of breaking away, and while doing a very kind of serious history, at the same time thinking of our friends out there.
All right. You made a comparison between.
I mentioned whom?
You made a comparison between your field and what happens to scientists,
Yes.
which I belong to, and there was the same attitude many decades ago of being very isolated and talking to one's community. But over the years, something has developed. And that is the scientists have become aware that it's very important.
Sorry, over the years what?
Over the years, the scientific community has realized that it's very important to talk to people that are not scientists.
Yeah.
And there is, although initially we were suspicious of scientists that became popularizers of the field, that has become accepted. And there is a real strong tendency at the moment to bring out the field of astronomy, in which I am, or physics, to the public, and often to write 2 types of books. Not just the book that you're trying to write, which covers both the professional area and appeals to others, but maybe 2 books, one that appeals to the professional community and others that are slightly different but cover the same topic, which can refer to the other one. But I find commonality in what you've been talking about in the field I'm working in.
If I've followed, if I've understood what you said, I think your point is a very good one. For instance, in London, I have among some of my friends, there are 2 scientists. One of them, in fact, was a man named John Maddox, who's the ex-editor of Nature. And these guys, they're extremely interested in getting out and talking to to their friends, a wide public. And when a scientist produces a popular book, they know at once whether it is serious or not, whether it is dumbed down or not, and they will applaud the book that is well done and respectively done and simply dismiss the others. And in fact, I think that much more of this kind of reaching out is indeed taking place in the field of science, for obvious reasons, than in ours, where we think that we're so close and yet we're very far in some ways.
Not the other one. Don't grab the other one.
Okay. I find your discussion of mass versus specialized audiences very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what your opinion of fictionalized accounts of history are, and I'm thinking of some books in particular in the Italian field. I'm thinking of Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, for example, from the 80s. I'm thinking much more recently of a couple books. There seems to be a flourish of fictionalized books that have to do with Dante. There's a recent book by Matthew Pearl called The Dante Club, which is a murder mystery that takes place in 19th century Boston, but it's steeped in history, medieval and sort of more recent history. There's another book by Nick Tosches called In the Hand of Dante, which is steeped very much in history and the history of philosophy, but is also hugely fictionalized in fantasy. I'm wondering what you think the role of those sorts of things are in bringing history to the masses, as it were.
Well, look, again, if I heard you rightly, it's interesting and curious that the historical novel is in, I think it's probably in here, it's in England, I know, and on the continent. There must be something about the contemporary world that drives people towards the past, thinking, well, they have a more worked out, a more clearly defined world. And I see nothing wrong with that. But I've read enough historical novels to say, I would generalize this way and say that there are some which are superb and some that are dreadful. It very much depends on the historian, on the kind of research they've done, on how much. There's one that's just been published in this field. It's coming out here next year. It's called The Birth of Venus, and it's by Sarah Dunant. And it's about a young woman who reads and speaks Latin in the 1490s and falls in love with a young painter. And there's some marvelous things in that novel, and some other things that I would quarrel with. One can pick up bits and pieces of history in historical novels, but unless you actually know that particular period, there's no way of knowing what you should pick up and what you should not pick up.
Well then, thanks to you all. Please join us for a glass of wine, and Professor Martinez will take a seat at the table over here. I think we'll get him a glass of wine too, and he would be happy to sign the books of those of you who have them.
And thank you all
Thanks
very
for
much
coming.
for coming.
Lauro Martinez is a reviewer for the Times Literary Supplement. April Blood, Florence and the Plot Against the Medici is published by Oxford University Press, on the web at oup-usa.org. Next week on History on Book TV, Martha Ackerman's account of the 13 American